So where to begin? After last week, I was a little downtrodden, a little upset, but this week, I'm feeling a lot better about the game and where it's going. Let me tell you what I got prepared for my players. Welcome back, fellow Game Masters, to another campaign log. This time, I am more prepared than I have been the last couple weeks. I got a lot of ideas and a lot of things I'm going to be able to throw at my players, not just in tonight's session, but in the future as well. So this whole new plan of mine all started by reading about a group of wizards in the D&D lore called the Eight. Now the Eight, if what I remember is correct or what I read is true, they were wizards that had a lot to do with forming the magics in Faerun in the Forgotten Realms world, and as such, a lot of the spells and things were named after them over time. I'm probably inaccurate on that, but that's fine. Don't quote me on it. So, but what that gave me the idea is, I really need more than just one villain for my adventure party. And if you're watching this party, skip ahead to the end. Don't watch this one, because there might be spoilers, because it's a bigger setup here. Anyways, so I had the idea of setting up an 8, my own version of the 8, which will be a kind of a nega party. So I have my players here, and then it will be like the direct opposites. Not exactly in terms of one rogue and one wizard and one this and that. I won't really go into that much detail with it, but I will say everything will be kind of an opposition. And there will be 8 other NPCs out in the world that are the villains. These are kind of the generals. And I did mention in the game before, we set it up with the generals, but this is more expanding on that and making it more of what it could be. This backstory of these generals is that they're all apostates from other religions. So, for example, Baal and Helm, who are the 2 gods that were already murdered, each have one of their followers became an apostate and then became a general for Cyric. And that's the 8. So each one will have its own kind of apostate follower. And happy accident, I happened to give the players a list of 6 gods last week that were the next in line that Cyric was going to kill. So that also gives me an idea, kind of a baseline for setting up these new NPCs, these generals and villains, to actually be related to those gods. And it sets it up as a nice 8, which is a perfect number. And in my head, my creativity, I enjoy the idea that this 8 is similar to the 8 in the actual D&D lore, but different because it's our world. So that's kind of what I have planned in the big future. In later on, other session setups, I'll probably talk about some of these generals a little more. Because these guys, they're going to be bad, they're going to be the generals, they're going to be pretty messed up. And I think by having these generals active in the world and doing things, it can give me a lot more creativity to continue the story even when my players aren't around it. Where one general can be in a city doing something and another can be somewhere else doing something. And I think that's a good place to be creatively for a GM. As far as tonight's session goes, they could decide to go get the Gnomes, which I already have set up based on like a Gnome society, a Gnome group in Silvery Moon or any other town. They can go find them and make a deal to take them back to Badamoons, or they might just ignore it completely and go to find the god Kasuth. I have them set up right now. They are kind of, their idea seems to be go talk to the gods, and they made them succeed with Lathander, and he gave them some information, and they gave him some information, and it was a good trade-off, a good little back and forth there in the last session. But in the future, I want them to work a little harder at it. So the other gods are going to be a little more standoffish. They're not going to be as in contact with their followers the same way as Lathander was, and I think that can make for a good if not slower story progression as the characters go, because they'll have to deal with people instead of gods, and people are flawed. Gods are flawed too in this world, but it'll give them something a little more to grasp onto and to work with. And having the 8 there, it gives me more information that I can give to the players throughout time when they are asking for it. Anyways, that is my session prep. It's really basic. I haven't got into the details. Maybe in the future I'll start giving more details and like stat blocks and showing how I prepare things. But for these, it's just a brief overview of here's what I'm expecting. That's all I got for this week. Again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the recap next time. So that session turned out to be rather interesting in all the right ways. So, as I explained before, I was gonna have the players, I was preparing this general's information, the 8 that was going on, but I knew the players had a lot of other side quest things that they could be doing. So when the session started, they were already in Silvery Moon, so of course some of them decided they are gonna go get these gnomes. And was one of the highlights of the game. Last night's session was one where I saw the players really come out of their shells in terms of improvising and doing the yes and, where someone would say something and the others would go along with it, and there wasn't a lot of infighting, and arguing about what's the best plan. They would just take something and roll with it, and it was really fun to see that. And as the game progressed, we had a lot of really fun, kind of a little more whimsical, weird moments, but it made for a fun story, and I think it was really interesting and entertaining for us as a table to experience these together. Starting with the gnomes, once the group that was going to get the gnomes arrived at the gnome quarter that was in Silvery Moon, they had to get the attention of all the gnomes they could get. So they began a musical performance led by not the bard. Basically, everyone who wasn't the bard got in on playing instruments of some sort or making a commotion to try to get some attention to the center of this city square, where in the middle was our fairy Pip. Because he was the little guy. He was the smallest one. He fit the size of everyone else. But we had our dragonborn pounding on a drum. We had our human and our dragonborn pounding on a barrel like a drum. We had the human and our soul reaver running around just trying to get at people's attention and hollering. And then we had the fairy playing the bagpipes, because he has the bagpipes for some reason. He's a rogue. He's not a bard, but for some reason D&D Beyond said he gets bagpipes, or a musical instrument, but he took it, and that was fine. After he got the attention of the people, then our bard came in to explain the situation and convince the gnomes that he needed them to come with them to Baramoons to participate in this gnome toss for the king's birthday. Now, they had a couple problems, which I will explain how I opted for them to solve. This one was they had to compensate the gnomes a little bit. They weren't going to go for free. They had to explain what they were doing, and so they did. They explained it as a gnome toss, where they were going to be tossed a distance, there was going to be protection and padding, and they worked on their deception or persuasion checks, and they succeeded in convincing the gnomes of that. On top of that, they offered all 1,000 gold to go to the gnomes that they were carrying. So that right there was a lot. Like, they had this option to get 1,000 gold. They had this option to get 1,000 gold, but then they decided to give it to the gnomes as compensation for their efforts. But getting them from Silvery Moon to Baramoons was an effort because, well, they didn't have a whole lot of transportation, and Baramoons is a long ways away. I had given my players a flying vehicle I described it as a van. We've started just calling it the van. It's a flying van. Not big enough for 200 gnomes, but they had the idea to put them all in a bag of holding. So I said, why not? 200 gnomes stuffed in a bag of holding would still probably weigh less than the max capacity, at least in my world it will, and I told them you got 10 hours to get them to the city after you put them in the bag. So that began this process of reuniting the party, as several other players had split from this main group. They had gone off to do their own thing, and to get to Baramoons. Now, the first person they went to go get was the group wizard, she drove the van from Baramoons to Silvery Moon, so she didn't get a long rest when that happened, so she had decided to go take a 4-hour trance. So they waited, they partied with the gnomes a bit, and then they went to find her at her hotel, which, taking a whole lot of gnomes to a hotel is one thing, but the way they did it was even more spectacular, as the fairy of the group decided to go off to find the elf wizard by himself. As he went off, others followed, and in the end, the bard decided to call all the gnomes to follow him as he led them to the hotel, or the inn where they were staying, because the fairy was carrying the bag of holding. So picture that, a tabaxi, or a cat person, leading the way down the streets of Silvery Moon, with a line of 200 gnomes following behind him, and the very first one is the youngest, a young child gnome of about 8 years old, just following along gleefully, ready to go on an adventure and to participate in the gnome toss. They got to the inn, they put him in the bag, and they headed off towards the van, where they were met by their other companion, who is the druid of the party, who had gone off to do some research. He decided to play a little trick on the cat person by turning into a dog before he approached them. This made the cat person jump up onto the roof and try to hide and stay out of sight, which he did successfully, but they made it back to their van. They got loaded up. The bard cat did not want to go in the van with the druid as the dog. He's afraid of dogs because he's a cat. Makes sense. So instead, he decided to hop up on the roof of the van, where he found a little place to hold on to as they began their trip. 8 hours over land, flying in their flying van to Baramoons. Knowing that their teammate was on the roof, the players, not metagaming, they didn't metagame this, they used their rolls and they used their perceptions to determine that someone was on the roof, and it was probably Durbin the Bard. So, by metagaming, or by rolling through that, they were able to determine those things, and they tried to get him down, which meant opening the door of the van and trying to climb up and get his attention, which they attempted. But when you're flying 1,000 feet up in the air at a very high speed, things become rather difficult. So one of the rogues, the Soul Reaver rogue, had to go up and use some strength checks to try and pull himself up to talk to the bard, which at one point he failed, which began a whole chain reaction of people falling out of the van as they were trying to catch him, and the door was open and the wind was blowing and things were happening. So in the end, it came down to a chain of people, with our barbarian, the dragonborn, holding on to 4 people who were stringing out the side of this van. And it was a fantastic sight in our brains, and it was awesome. The wizard who was driving at the time noticed the shift in weight and the change of things, and the little notification that the door was open, and decided to spin the van a little bit to get everyone back inside and slow down on the brakes to shut the door, as minivan people do. Barely made it in. Everyone got in, but it was a little touch and go for a little bit, and they had to use a sword to kind of wedge into the door to keep it from shutting on them, but they were able to get in, except the bard was still stuck on the roof. After a little bit, the van righted itself, the bard was fine, and then they decided, oh, let's punch a hole through the roof. Okay, punch a hole through the roof of a magic flying vehicle that you don't know how it works. That was how you break it. So they broke the van, and they ended up crashing in the outskirts of the forest outside of Baramoons, which I have dubbed Dewey, the Forest of Dewey. In the forest, the druid broke the game using the very powerful combo of summon some woodland creatures, which are pixies, and then have each of the pixies cast polymorph on his companions. He turned the entire party into giant eagles, and they began to fly to Baramoons. But the problem was, they crashed the van into the woods and they just kind of left it there. They didn't clean up the van or try to fix it or anything. So of course they're going to get attacked by the keeper of the woods and the guardians, a treant who begins to whoop them in giant eagle form. The party does make pretty quick work of it, but they don't kill it. They decide to leave it, and they just, step back, fly away, and get back to Baramoons, knowing now that the keeper of the forest is not happy with the amount of vans that have been crashed in the Forest of Dewey. So that gives them yet another plot hook if they choose to go with it. If not, that is fine. In the next session, we will likely experience gnome tossing finally, which I will probably have to come up with some mechanics for that, which I'll probably discuss. I'm going to make a note for myself to come up with mechanics and discuss that in the setup video for next week. But that has been the recap of this session. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a lot of fun for us to play it, and we'll see you next time.